November 13th, 1942, just before 2 in the morning. Iron Bottom Sound, Guadalcanal. A searchlight beam cut through the humid tropical darkness as Captain Tamichihara gripped the bridge rail of the destroyer Amatsukaze, watching in horrified fascination as American shells detonated all around his vessel like a volcanic eruption of molten steel and fire consuming everything in its path. They are not aiming at anything specific. They are simply pouring metal into the sky. Those hastily scribbled words in his personal log that night would capture a fundamental truth that would determine the entire outcome of the Pacific War long before most Japanese officers even grasped what was happening. In just 35 seconds, USS San Francisco would discharge more 5-inch shells than some entire Japanese destroyer squadrons carried for their complete operational assignments. The Americans weren't thinking about conserving ammunition. They were constructing barriers of fire that transformed the darkness into something resembling artificial daylight, turning night into day. Gun barrels glowing an intense red from the relentless firing. Meanwhile, 2,700 miles away at Pearl Harbor, ammunition vessels were already preparing the next enormous shipment. 15,000 tons of shells, sufficient to replace everything the American fleet would expend during this single engagement 50 times over and still have ammunition remaining. In Tokyo, naval planners were doing their own calculations, desperately trying to determine whether they could allocate 12 rounds per gun for the next supply convoy mission. The mathematics of their defeat were being recorded in brass casings and explosive powder, in production statistics that contradicted every premise the Imperial Navy had operated under about fighting against the United States. Captain Hara would endure to become the sole Japanese destroyer commander to see combat from Pearl Harbor straight through to the nation's surrender, experiencing a complete transformation that shattered not only individual ships, but the entire philosophical foundation of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This awakening had actually started 6 months before this moment, though most observers failed to understand its significance. Back on May 7, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, Commander Takeshi Naito, serving as executive officer aboard carrier Shokaku, observed something deeply troubling that puzzled him profoundly. American cruisers and destroyers had maintained continuous anti-aircraft fire for 4 straight hours, never appearing to stop or worry about preserving ammunition supplies. Every American destroyer, as he would eventually testify to interrogators, appeared to carry more anti-aircraft ammunition than our complete destroyer division possessed in total. The observation seemed almost unbelievable, almost beyond reality. Japanese military doctrine, honed and refined across many decades, had always assumed that all maritime powers encountered comparable ammunition limitations. The Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft gun, Japan's primary light AA weapon, operated under rigid firing procedures: hold fire until attacking aircraft approached 800 meters, discharge short bursts, consisting of only 3 to 5 rounds, cease fire immediately when targets moved beyond optimal firing range. Not because this strategy was particularly smart tactically, but because ammunition reserves were far too limited to support any other method. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, stationed aboard carrier Ryujo, had drilled his gunners extensively in these exact procedures. Every single gunner understood clearly that their vessel's ammunition magazines contained enough for precisely 12 minutes of continuous anti-aircraft defense. Beyond that duration, they would have nothing left to fight with. The Americans, he noticed with growing dread, seemed capable of firing without stopping for many hours. Yet the complete picture would not emerge until Guadalcanal, where the brutal mathematics of industrial-scale warfare would be written in human blood and metal across the surrounding waters. The Americans would call it Iron Bottom Sound. February 27, 1942. The Battle of the Java Sea should have represented a Japanese victory, and from a tactical perspective, it undoubtedly was. However, Captain Hara, leading destroyer Amatsukaze, observed something that disturbed him far more than any direct enemy fire. The combined force of American, British, Dutch, and Australian ships operating under Rear Admiral Carroll Dorman fired 1,619 rounds of 8-inch shells during the entire engagement, managing to achieve only 5 actual hits, and 4 of those proved to be complete failures. The Japanese, by contrast, fired considerably less ammunition but scored devastating hits. Yet Hara recorded something deeply troubling in his official battle report. Those Allied vessels never seemed to stop firing, never appeared worried about how much ammunition they were using, continued at rates that would have completely emptied Japanese ammunition storage in the opening hour. They fired as though their ammunition supplies were endless, Hara would later write in his memoir that appeared decades afterward. Certainly their gunnery was poor, yes, but they possessed such vast quantities of ammunition that hitting targets accurately became less important than simply putting more rounds downrange. The Japanese achieved complete victory that day. 2 Allied cruisers and 3 destroyers destroyed. Nevertheless, in the ship's wardroom afterward, Hara overheard a conversation that deeply disturbed him. His gunnery officer, Lieutenant Yoshida, was working through ammunition calculations. "Captain, we expended 40% of our main battery ammunition. Had the engagement continued even 2 hours longer, we would have had nothing." Hara silenced him with merely a glance, yet the mathematics were impossible to ignore. The Amatsukaze had begun with 2,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. In a single battle, they had consumed 800. The destroyed Allied cruiser HMS Exeter, based on testimonies from sailors they pulled from the water, had fired more than 1,500 rounds from her 8-inch guns alone. That exceeded the total ammunition complement of most Japanese heavy cruisers. August 7, 1942, when American forces invaded Guadalcanal, the Imperial Navy's reaction exposed the ammunition shortage in unmistakable fashion. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's assault force, racing south from Rabaul, carried ammunition sufficient for exactly 1 nighttime engagement. Not because this was strategically advantageous, but because that represented everything available in Rabaul's storage facilities. The Battle of Savo Island on August 9th appeared to vindicate Japanese combat methods. Within 33 minutes, Mikawa's force destroyed 4 Allied heavy cruisers, killing over 1,000 sailors. The Japanese suffered 0 losses, yet concealed within this tactical achievement lay strategic catastrophe. Commander Toshikazu Omi, Mikawa's operations officer, would eventually confess to American interrogators. "We withdrew after the battle not from concern about air attack, as you Americans believed, but because we had essentially exhausted our ammunition supplies. We had nothing remaining for any additional engagement. The American transport vessels, vulnerable and packed with cargo, were left untouched simply because the Japanese lacked the physical ammunition to attack them. Japanese forces had fired 471 rounds total and achieved merely 10 hits, producing a hit rate of only 2.1% that Tokyo would later condemn as wasteful. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away at Pearl Harbor, Captain William Poco Smith supervised the loading of ammunition vessel USS Rainier. Her supply manifest for this single voyage, 5,000 tons of naval ammunition comprising 350,000 rounds of 5-inch shells, 1.2 million rounds of 40mm, 3 million rounds of 20mm. This single cargo contained more ammunition than the entire combined Japanese fleet would expend across the following 3 months. The celebrated Tokyo Express operations, high-speed destroyer supply missions to resupply Guadalcanal, exposed the ammunition crisis with stark clarity. On November 30, 1942, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka led 8 destroyers on yet another supply run. The supply manifest discovered among captured documents told everything. Riser, 1,100 drums. Medical supplies, 200 drums. Ammunition, 280 drums. For 15,000 desperate soldiers struggling on the island, fewer than 300 drums of ammunition. Each drum contained roughly 300 rifle rounds or equivalent weight in other munitions. The entire Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal was depending on ammunition deliveries representing what a single American destroyer could expend in 20 minutes of actual combat. Captain Hara, commanding Amatsukaze on these missions, wrote bitterly in his logs, "We risk 8 destroyers, put dozens of men in danger, expend tons of precious fuel, simply to deliver what the Americans probably squander in target practice." He was far more accurate than he realized. That same day, destroyer USS Fletcher conducted a routine gunnery exercise, expending 127 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, roughly equivalent to half a drum from Tanaka's scarce cargo. The numbers were absolutely staggering, completely incomprehensible to Japanese planners who had calculated the entire war based on their own production limitations. Naval Ammunition Depot Hastings, Nebraska, came online in March 1943. Constructed across 48,000 acres of prairie containing 2,200 buildings and 207 miles of railroad track, it employed 10,000 workers at peak capacity. This single facility manufactured 40% of the U.S. Navy's ammunition throughout the entire war. In merely its first month operating, Hastings produced greater quantities of naval ammunition than all Japanese facilities combined would manufacture for the remainder of 1943. The facility concentrated on 5-inch 38 caliber ammunition, the essential component of American naval firepower. Production started at 100,000 rounds monthly, escalating to 300,000 rounds monthly by September 1943. Every single round underwent rigorous inspection, testing, and quality verification before shipping, rejecting more ammunition than Japanese factories produced. Naval Ammunition Depot McAllister in Oklahoma opened at the same time. Its specialization, large-caliber shells and aerial bombs. Monthly output by December 1943, 50,000 16-inch shells, 120,000 8-inch shells, 200,000 5-inch shells, plus 500,000 pounds of aerial ordnance. Peak workforce, 8,619. In contrast, back in Japan, the Kure Naval Arsenal, the nation's finest ammunition manufacturing facility, struggled to produce merely 10,000 shells of all types combined monthly. The Toyokawa Naval Arsenal underwent massive expansion at tremendous expense starting in 1940, achieving peak monthly production of 35,000 machine guns and 4.5 million rounds, accomplished only by deploying 56,000 workers, which included 6,000 schoolchildren forcibly conscripted, aged 12 through 16, working in conditions that endangered their lives. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated the most striking display of ammunition disparity throughout the entire war. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had assembled 9 carriers with 473 aircraft, hoping for the decisive engagement that would turn the war around. His counterpart, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanded 15 carriers with 956 aircraft. But more critically, his task force possessed something Ozawa could never imagine: virtually unrestricted ammunition. Lieutenant Sadamu Takahashi, flying a Zero fighter launched from Carrier Taiho, was shot down and survived, later recounting his approach toward the American fleet. The entire sky turned black with explosions. Not individual shots, but one continuous wall of fire. They weren't targeting us specifically. They were filling every cubic meter of air with projectiles and steel. The Americans operated with mechanical precision. Every 5-inch gun maintained 15 rounds per minute. Every 40mm mount discharged 120 rounds per minute. The 20mm cannons sprayed 450 rounds per minute. Destroyer USS Stockholm alone fired 12,000 rounds of 40mm and 20,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition across 6 hours of fighting. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace, observed from his Hellcat, the Japanese aircraft flew directly into a curtain of fire. Our ships weren't attempting to hit individual planes. They were establishing zones of death that no aircraft could penetrate successfully. The results were mechanically efficient. Japanese aircraft losses, 476, including those from sinking carriers. American aircraft losses, 29. American ammunition consumed, 200,000 rounds of 5-inch, 500,000 rounds of 40mm, 1.2 million rounds of 20mm. Japanese pilots rescued 59. Words from rescued pilots: it was not battle, it was execution conducted by machines. October 25, 1944, at 6:58 in the morning, near Samar Island in the Philippines. The David versus Goliath moment that would represent the ammunition war's defining engagement was beginning. Admiral Takayu Kurita's center force, comprising 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, had achieved complete tactical surprise against Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. What transpired next violated every expectation. Commander Ernest Evans, leading destroyer USS Johnston, reacted without hesitation. All hands to general quarters. Prepare to attack major Japanese fleet units. All engines ahead flank. Left full rudder. In the following hour, Johnston would discharge over 200 rounds from her 5-inch guns at heavy cruiser Kumano, achieving 40 hits that devastated her superstructure. Johnston subsequently engaged battleship Congo, firing 30 rounds while generating protective smoke. Her gunners were not aiming with precision, they were simply unleashing fire at maximum capacity. On destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland made a decision that would determine the outcome. "We are going in, boys. This engagement will be fought against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot reasonably be expected." What Copeland did not mention was that his vessel carried only 325 rounds per gun, 1,625 rounds total. Over the following 35 minutes, Roberts would discharge over 600 rounds from just a single gun mount, consuming nearly 40% of her complete ammunition magazine at rates that caused her gun barrels to glow white-hot. Gunners made third-class Paul H. Carr, gun captain of Mount 52, persisted in firing even after the mount lost electrical power. He and his crew manually loaded and fired 6 additional rounds before a massive explosion. Carr was discovered dying, still gripping the final 5-inch shell, attempting to load it into the destroyed gun. On the Japanese side, battleship Yamato, the most formidable warship ever constructed, fired her main guns in anger for the sole occasion against surface targets during the entire war. Though the exact number of rounds cannot be positively established, she fired multiple massive 18.1-inch shells. However, her ammunition magazines contained armor-piercing shells engineered for battleship combat. Against thin-hulled escort carriers, these projectiles penetrated without detonating. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding Battleship Division 1, recorded in his diary that evening, "Those enemy destroyers charged directly through their own smoke, firing without interruption. Such ammunition consumption from such small vessels defies reasonable calculation. The battle statistics communicate the reality plainly. American ammunition expended approximately 20,000 rounds of all types. Japanese ammunition expended approximately 3,000 rounds of all types. American ships lost 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, 1 escort carrier. Japanese ships damaged from gunfire, 3 heavy cruisers damaged severely. The result, Japanese withdrawal despite possessing overwhelming superiority. The production war's reality." By late 1944, American ammunition production had reached magnitudes that bewildered Japanese thinking. The real scope was extraordinary. The United States manufactured 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition between 1941 and 1945, with 41.4 billion being rifle and pistol ammunition specifically. This represented enough ammunition, as one general remarked, for 10 shots at every single human being alive on the planet. Production numbers for November 1944. United States small arms ammunition, 3.5 billion rounds. 5-inch shells, 1.2 million. 40mm rounds, 8 million. 20mm rounds, 20 million. 16-inch shells, 10,000. 14-inch shells, 15,000. 18-inch shells, 40,000. 6-inch shells, 60,000. Japan, all ammunition combined, approximately 15 million rounds for the complete war. The Crane Naval Ammunition Depot in Indiana alone occupied 63,000 acres and employed 10,000 workers. Its storage capacity, 2,000 individual magazines holding 400,000 tons of ammunition. To contextualize this, the entire Imperial Japanese Navy's ammunition inventory in December 1941 totaled roughly 200,000 tons. The human element revealed the same disparity. At Hastings, workers inhabited specially constructed dormitories. 8 cafeterias served 15,000 meals daily. Recreational facilities included bowling alleys and movie theaters. Children attended schools built specifically for the facility's needs. It was essentially an entire city designed and built for manufacturing instruments of war. At Toyokawa Naval Arsenal, a 12-year-old named Akiko Sato labored through 12-hour shifts packing shell casings. In her post-war memoir, she recalled, "We were perpetually starving. They provided us one rice ball for our lunch break. We continued working until our bodies gave way. Plenty of my fellow students never made it home. They died in factory mishaps while we worked. Each day, our section managed to produce roughly 100 shells. Meanwhile, the Americans could fire that quantity in a single second. This shortage of ammunition trapped Japan in a downward spiral that pushed the nation closer to surrender. When bullets and shells became precious resources, training programs collapsed. Every round needed to be saved for actual fighting. Even Japan's best surviving fighter pilot, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, witnessed firsthand how this scarcity devastated the war effort. Young pilots joining the military in 1944 got between 40 and 60 hours of flight time before heading into combat. Back in 1941, they'd trained for a minimum of 700 hours. The difference was staggering, yet gunnery training proved even worse. Rookie pilots practiced their shooting with maybe 100 rounds total. American pilots, they had thousands of practice rounds available. The gap was enormous. At Pensacola Naval Air Station, American fighter pilots averaged 5,000 rounds during their advanced training stages. Ammunition for drills never ran out. If a trainee showed weak aim, instructors simply gave him more chances to practice until his accuracy improved. American pilots maintained 400 to 525 hours of flying experience as the war dragged on. Ensign Kiyoshi Eto, who trained during the final months of 1944, explained what his actual combat preparation looked like. "I fired my guns exactly 3 times before I flew my first real mission. That meant 10 rounds on each attempt, 30 rounds in total to prepare for war. When I encountered an American pilot on my first actual mission, he probably emptied 30 rounds in just 1 second. Anti-aircraft crews faced an even grimmer reality. Japanese military doctrine demanded that gunners wait until attacking planes came within 800 meters before opening fire. That's basically point-blank range for aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour. The reasoning seemed logical at the time. Beyond that distance, the odds of hitting anything dropped below 0.5%, making ammunition use wasteful and foolish. American gunners trained using completely different principles. Seaman First Class Robert Scott manned a 20mm gun aboard USS New Jersey and recalled his training with clarity. "We shot at everything available, sleeves dragged behind planes, balloons floating in the sky, targets bobbing on the water. I probably went through 50,000 rounds during my training period. The instant I spotted an actual Japanese aircraft, my hands and reflexes took over without conscious thought. I didn't worry about wasting ammunition. I simply filled the entire sky with projectiles wherever he had to go. The logistical support system backing Task Force 38 represented an innovation in naval operations that Japanese strategists had never imagined. Service Squadron 10 functioned as the fleet's mobile supply force and included 34 tankers carrying fuel oil. 11 escort carriers stood ready to deliver replacement combat aircraft. The convoy also had 19 ammunition vessels, 16 refrigerated ships for food and supplies, 8 hospital ships, 12 fleet tugs for towing, and 29 destroyer escorts providing armed protection. During July 21 through July 22, 1945, Task Group 30.8 performed what observers called probably the largest replenishment operation at sea ever recorded, transferring 6,369 tons of ammunition alone. That delivery included 379,157 barrels of fuel oil, an additional 1,635 tons of food and supplies, 99 replacement aircraft, plus 421 replacement personnel. One single resupply run delivered more ammunition than the vast majority of Japanese naval bases kept in their entire storage depots. After the war ended, Commander Soemu Toyoda, who led Japan's combined fleet, acknowledged the fundamental problem. "We did our calculations based on what we could manage ourselves. If Japan could allocate 1,000 rounds for an operation, we estimated maybe the Americans possessed 3,000. The actual figure was 100,000. That number was simply incomprehensible to us." April 6, 1945, Operation Ten Go, the desperate suicide attack by the mighty battleship Yamato, provided perhaps the starkest illustration of how severe the ammunition gap had become. Yamato departed with 1,170 rounds loaded for her massive 18.1-inch cannons, roughly 130 rounds per gun, representing virtually every shell Japan could spare. She also carried 1,629 rounds meant for her secondary 6.1-inch guns, plus 13,520 anti-aircraft rounds. This represented literally everything available. Her backup gun systems carried merely 60% of their standard ammunition allowance. Her anti-aircraft defenses held enough ammunition for only 12 minutes of continuous shooting. Captain Kosaku Aruga spoke to his assembled crew. "We are sailing with enough ammunition for a single engagement. There will be no replacement ammunition coming. Make every single round count." On April 7th, approximately 386 American aircraft attacked in successive waves. The opening wave radioed back that the target was throwing up extraordinary anti-aircraft fire. By the time the third wave arrived, the anti-aircraft response had diminished noticeably. When the fifth wave came in, the anti-aircraft fire had become sporadic and weak. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, among the rare survivors from Yamato, recalled those final horrifying minutes. The 25mm guns stopped firing first. The ammunition boxes were empty. Then the 127mm guns went silent. Eventually, even the main armament had expended its last shell. We had become a 70,000-ton target. Nothing else. The American aircraft carriers involved in these attacks had received fresh supplies just 3 days before. USS Essex alone received 500 tons of ammunition, about 400,000 rounds in various sizes. Her air squadrons would discharge 200,000 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition attacking Yamato. They understood that supplies arriving tomorrow would replenish everything they fired away. The ammunition crisis produced cascading consequences throughout Japanese civilian life. By 1944, the desperate need for copper to manufacture shell casings sparked organized collection campaigns that seized temple bells, many from the 8th century. Bronze monuments, including precious national treasures, were melted into metal. Everyday household goods ranging from cooking pots to window frames were taken away. Japan destroyed 45,000 Buddhist temple bells for weapons manufacturing between 1937 and 1945, which represented 90% of every temple bell in the nation. Every bell, often weighing several hundred kilograms and made up of 85% copper with 12 to 15% tin, held tremendous value for making shells. 13-year-old Yukiko Tanaka recorded her thoughts in her diary. "They removed the bell from our school today for weapons production." Our teacher, Yamamoto, wept openly. He explained the bell had been ringing for 200 years. How many shells will they make from it? How much time will those shells actually last once the battle begins? The reality was painful to consider. A single temple bell, weighing 500 kilograms, could yield enough metal for approximately 2,000 smaller shells. An American naval destroyer's 40mm gun could expend that entire quantity in just 16 minutes of fighting. Working conditions at Japanese munitions plants grew progressively worse. At the Toyokawa Naval Arsenal, injury and accident rates climbed to 15% monthly by 1945. Tired young workers handled volatile explosives without adequate training or protection. On August 7, 1945, a B-29 bombing mission destroyed the arsenal, taking 2,477 lives, the majority of them teenagers. Compare this story with American worker Mary Roberts, who produced shells at a Hastings facility. "We worked regular 8-hour shifts, just 5 days a week, earned decent wages of $1.20 an hour, ate quality meals in the company cafeteria, and watched movies every single Friday. We truly believed we were defeating them, one shell at a time." American military approaches evolved to take advantage of their ammunition surplus, while Japanese methods grew increasingly desperate and survival-focused. Admiral Willis Ching Lee, recognized as the Navy's greatest surface combat strategist, created a revolutionary concept he called area saturation for nighttime naval engagements. Instead of attempting precise shots aimed at specific targets, American vessels would saturate wide areas with artillery fire, making it mathematically impossible for enemies to escape. At Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944, Lee's strategic vision reached its fullest expression. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded the battle line that unleashed 285 16-inch rounds, 310 14-inch rounds, and countless 8-inch and 6-inch projectiles within merely 18 minutes. The Japanese battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, traveling light on ammunition to conserve tonnage and fuel, managed to respond with barely 100 rounds combined before being destroyed completely. Lieutenant Commander Tokuno Horishi managed to survive the Yamashiro's sinking and described what occurred. Artillery fell continuously overhead, like rainfall. The shells weren't targeting us as individuals. They simply created a continuous wall of explosions everywhere. We fired back into the blackness, but the rate was terrifying. For every shell we sent toward them, 50 came back in return. Japanese approaches became increasingly extreme. The special attack teams, the kamikaze pilots, represented the ultimate logical conclusion to the ammunition shortage. When conventional firepower becomes too scarce to use casually, the answer becomes to use people themselves as weapons. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi designed and commanded the kamikaze operation and later privately confessed the fundamental truth. We resort to body crashes because we simply lack sufficient ammunition for traditional assaults. One pilot, one airplane, replaces hundreds of shells we cannot produce. American intelligence specialists intercepting and decoding Japanese naval transmissions understood the ammunition emergency and incorporated this knowledge into strategic planning. A decoded transmission from December 1944 revealed the severity plainly. Combined fleet ammunition status: 16-inch at 15% of minimum required, 14-inch at 22% of minimum required, 8-inch at 18% of minimum required, 5-inch at 31% of minimum required, anti-aircraft critical shortage across all calibers. Admiral Chester Nimitz received this decoded intelligence and commented to his commanders, "They are boxers who have lost their striking power. We simply keep punching until they collapse." American strategists shifted toward deliberately engineering operations to force Japanese forces to expend their dwindling ammunition. Feinting maneuvers, smaller raids, and probing actions were designed not necessarily to win tactical victories, but specifically to drain Japanese ammunition supplies. Commander Joseph Rushfort, the celebrated code-breaking expert, observed a crucial pattern. We could actually forecast Japanese military movements by examining their ammunition requisition requests. Whenever they requested resupply, we understood they couldn't engage in major combat for at least 14 days. We controlled when every battle would happen. American submarines proved devastating against Japanese ammunition shipments, generating critical supply gaps throughout Japan's territories. The figures were shocking. Japanese ammunition transport vessels destroyed numbered 147. Total tonnage of ammunition lost approximated 500,000 tons. The percentage of ammunition shipments that fell to submarines reached 55%. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mosh Morton, commanding USS Wahoo, destroyed the ammunition ship Fushi Maru in January 1943. The resulting explosion could be seen from 40 miles away. This single vessel contained more ammunition than the entire Rabaul military garrison would obtain during the following 3 months. Japanese officer Tatsuo Waka Shimazaki led an ammunition convoy and confronted an impossible dilemma. We loaded 10,000 tons of shells at port for transport to Rabaul. We dispatched 4 transport vessels. By the time we reached our destination, 2 were destroyed and another suffered serious damage. We only delivered 2,000 tons total. Submarines captured the remainder. The emotional weight on Japanese logistics managers became unbearable. Commander Yoshiro Tanaka handled ammunition distribution throughout the Philippines and took his own life in October 1944 after being unable to provide essential supplies to combat forces. His suicide note conveyed his despair. "I send empty vessels out to die. The Americans sink them filled or empty regardless. Our artillery falls silent while theirs continues endlessly." When the fighting stopped, the production numbers revealed everything about the competition. American naval ammunition production from 1941 through 1945 produced enormous totals. The complete count across all ammunition types reached 47 billion rounds, with 41.4 billion being rifle and pistol cartridges. This entire quantity weighed 4.2 million tons. The highest monthly output came in March 1945, when 3.5 billion rounds were manufactured. Production happened in 47 different facilities. At peak capacity, nearly 486,000 workers were employed. Japanese naval ammunition production across the same period reached just approximately 15 million rounds total. The weight approximated 200,000 tons. The maximum monthly output occurred in November 1942, when 400,000 rounds were produced. Production occurred in only 11 locations. At maximum strength, roughly 95,000 workers participated, including young conscripted children. The disparity in small arms ammunition alone exceeded a 3,100 to 1 ratio favoring America. However, the actual gap grew even larger when factoring in quality. American proximity detonators, introduced in 1943, multiplied anti-aircraft effectiveness by 300 to 600%. Japanese detonators, weakened by metal shortages, showed a 30% failure rate by 1945. The ammunition imbalance transformed the thinking and morale inside both navies, ultimately determining how the Pacific conflict would conclude. American sailors operated with a sense of absolute freedom when it came to ammunition. For men like Seaman James Bradley, serving aboard the destroyer USS Lafay, worry simply didn't exist. The supply lines kept flowing. Every few days, fresh cargo arrived, mountains of ammunition stacked high on the decks of support vessels. There was a casual attitude that developed among the crews. They could practice their marksmanship on distant targets, fire at seagulls just to keep their skills sharp, and nobody back home would blink an eye. This mentality bred an aggressive confidence that changed how American forces fought. Destroyers didn't hesitate to challenge battleships. Smaller escort vessels attacked heavy cruisers. Fast torpedo boats engaged destroyers directly. Encounters that seemed impossible on paper became routine reality. David could afford to fight Goliath because David had an endless supply of stones. The experience for Japanese sailors moved in the opposite direction entirely. Lieutenant Kazuhiko Ono, who served as gunnery officer aboard the destroyer Isokaze, lived with a different burden pressing down on his shoulders. Every single shell that left the gun tubes needed to be justified. Each round was counted with the careful precision of a miser protecting coins. During combat, a part of every officer's mind stayed occupied doing calculations. Could they afford this shot? Should they fire now or wait? That hesitation, born from scarcity, often proved fatal when seconds mattered most. The psychological toll came into sharp focus through direct observation. Commander Tamichi Fukuda watched something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. After his destroyer sank, he was transferred aboard the American battleship USS New Jersey, where he witnessed a training exercise. The New Jersey fired 400 rounds during a single practice session. Fukuda later admitted he wept, not from shame over his capture, but from the sudden understanding of what had been arrayed against him. They expended more ammunition in training than his entire fleet carried into battle. He couldn't stop asking himself the same question over and over. How could anyone fight against such wealth? The ammunition gap reflected a massive economic divide between the two nations. America's gross national product in 1944 reached $2 trillion, more than 10 times what Japan could generate, but those broad numbers didn't capture the true scale of the disparity in what the two countries could actually manufacture. American ammunition production consumed staggering quantities of raw materials every single year. Copper, 450,000 tons annually. Lead, 380,000 tons annually. Steel, 2.8 million tons annually. Explosives, 3.2 million tons annually. By contrast, Japan's entire national consumption of these same materials, for everything combined, military and civilian together, never exceeded these levels. Copper reached only 80,000 tons annually. Lead came to just 25,000 tons annually. Steel hit 4 million tons annually, though most went to shipbuilding. Explosives totaled 200,000 tons annually. The United States manufactured more copper for shell casings alone than Japan could access for every electrical, industrial, and military application put together. American lead production for ammunition bullets exceeded Japan's total lead availability by a factor of 15. Beyond the raw numbers existed a technological advantage that multiplied American superiority. The proximity fuse, developed by Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, changed everything about air defense. Instead of requiring direct contact with a target, these shells exploded when their radar systems detected aircraft approaching nearby. The development program consumed $1 billion in 1940s money, equal to 5% of Japan's entire 1944 economic output. This made it the third costliest program of the entire war, second only to the Manhattan Project at $2 billion and the B-29 program at $3 billion. Manufacturing these fuses demanded precision that Japanese industry simply couldn't achieve. Each one contained miniaturized vacuum tubes that could endure 20,000 times the force of gravity when fired from a gun. By the war's end, American factories had produced 22 million of them. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, when USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber with her second salvo. The technology improved air defense effectiveness by between 300 and 600%. Admiral Kiyoshi Hasegawa observed these shells in action during a 1945 raid and reported his astonishment. The American shells exploded by magic, he said, knowing precisely when they drew near to our aircraft. Each blast landed perfectly positioned. This is not warfare. This is witchcraft accomplished through mathematics. Fire control systems showed similar gaps between the adversaries. American destroyers carried the Mark 37 gunfire control system. This marvel incorporated gyroscopic stabilization, automatic radar tracking, mechanical ballistic computation, electric servo drives, and remote power control. One system cost $500,000, more than a Japanese destroyer squadron's entire annual ammunition budget. This equipment allowed accurate fire in any weather, day or night, against maneuvering targets. Japanese fire control remained largely manual, depending on optical rangefinders that became useless when visibility suffered. Captain Toshiro Miura acknowledged the reality plainly. We aimed by eye while they aimed by machine. We guessed while they calculated. Every American shell traveled toward its target, guided by mathematics they couldn't possibly match. The ammunition disparity produced survival statistics that defied conventional military understanding. On April 16, 1945, the destroyer USS Leif endured 22 kamikaze attacks. She survived primarily because her guns never stopped firing. In 80 minutes, her crews pumped 345 rounds of 5-inch shells, 11,000 rounds of 40mm ammunition, and 20,000 rounds of 20mm rounds into the sky. Her gunners shot down 9 aircraft with certainty and damaged 4 more that crashed elsewhere. Despite absorbing 4 bomb hits and 6 kamikaze strikes, Leif lived because defensive fire degraded most attacks before they could deliver their full impact. Contrast that with destroyer Yagagi escorting the battleship Yamato. After 45 minutes of combat, her anti-aircraft ammunition ran dry. She could only maneuver helplessly as American planes attacked unopposed. 7 torpedo hits and 12 bomb hits later, she rolled over and sank. The cruiser USS Helena's ammunition expenditure deserves separate examination. Throughout her service from December 1941 until her sinking in July 1943, Helena fired a cumulative total of 10,639 rounds, 3,460 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, and 7,179 rounds of 6-inch ammunition. This total wasn't from one battle, but accumulated across all engagements, including Pearl Harbor, the Guadalcanal naval battles, and the Kolombangara Gulf, where she went down. Her crews earned her the nickname Machine Gun Cruiser for the relentless pace of her fire. At the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal on November 13, 1942, she fired so rapidly that Japanese observers believed she carried automatic 6-inch guns, weapons that didn't even exist. Her rate of fire exceeded what Japanese doctrine considered physically possible. Captain Hara captured something profound when he observed that Americans fired without thinking, while Japanese counted every round. This revealed more than a tactical difference. It exposed the war's fundamental nature, not conflict between comparable powers with temporary advantages or disadvantages, but industrial civilization crushing ambition born from tradition and spirit. The final numbers tell an overwhelming story. America expended 47 billion rounds total, including 41.4 billion rifle and pistol ammunition. Japan expended approximately 15 million rounds of all types. The ratio reached 3,100 to 1, yet those figures actually understate reality. American forces expended ammunition in training, in test firing, in harassment missions designed simply to keep enemy heads down. Japanese forces hoarded rounds until the moment of destruction. Americans fired to suppress, to intimidate, to dominate the battlefield through pure volume. Japanese fired only when they believed effect was certain. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, he referenced a new and most cruel bomb. But military leaders understood privately that the atomic bomb merely ended a defeat already certain. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the Navy's final commander, made this admission. We could construct ships without steel, we could fly planes without fuel, but we could not conduct warfare without ammunition. The Americans possessed infinite amounts. We had whatever we could salvage from our grandfathers' temples. In the ruins of Korematsu Arsenal, workers discovered a final production report dated August 14, 1945. Daily production, 73 shells of various calibers. Workforce, 423 people, including 200 middle school students. Status, critical shortage of materials. That same day, Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot reported very different numbers. Daily production, 45,000 shells of various calibers. Workforce, 5,800 people. Status, exceeding quota. Recommendation, reduce production due to anticipated war conclusion. The ammunition disparity teaches lessons beyond military history alone. Wars between industrial powers are decided not by courage, skill, or determination, though these matter, but by the capacity to convert raw materials into delivered destruction. Captain Hara survived to record his memories, unique among Japanese destroyer captains. His final judgment remained stark. We brought swords to a machine gun fight and wondered why we lost. The Americans didn't defeat our Navy, their factories did. Every shell they fired announced industrial supremacy we couldn't conceive of, much less match. The brass casings scattered across the Pacific's floor tell this story, each one stamped with American ordnance marks, each one representing industrial capacity that transformed warfare from art to arithmetic. Americans could fire without thinking, because thinking became unnecessary when supply was infinite. Japan counted every round because each one was irreplaceable treasure transformed into an instrument of war. But wars are won not by those who count. They are won by those who can afford not to count. Those who can fill the sky with steel and the sea with fire. Those who can convert industrial might into delivered destruction without hesitation or limit. Behind every statistic lay human tragedy. Ensign Takayo Matsui commanded a 25mm mount aboard the carrier Zukaku. During the Battle of Cape Engano, the carrier's final fight, he received 10 rounds for his weapon. He held his fire as American planes attacked repeatedly, waiting for the perfect shot that never came. Zuikaku sank with his unfired rounds still loaded. His mother received his final letter. I have 10 chances to protect our ship. I will make each one count. She never knew he died without firing a single shot, paralyzed by the terrible mathematics of scarcity. Meanwhile, Simon Robert Dixon, a 20mm gunner aboard USS Essex, fired 15,000 rounds during that same battle. He wrote home to his mother, "You wouldn't believe how many bullets we shoot. It's like a fireworks display that never ends. Don't worry about me. We've got so much ammunition nothing can get through." Both young men served their nations with equal courage, but one counted rounds while the other counted victories. The difference wasn't character, but industrial capacity. Not bravery, but brass casings. Not determination, but the ability to transform national wealth into naval firepower. 80 years after Japan's surrender, the ammunition disparities lessons still resonate. Military professionals study Captain Hara's observation not as historical curiosity, but as eternal truth. Wars between industrial powers are decided in factories before they're fought in fields. The Pacific War proved that industrial capacity, once mobilized, generates military power that no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome. American shells fell like rain because American factories produced like storms. Japanese shells were precious because Japanese factories produced like artisans. In the end, Captain Tamichihara's words stand as epitaph for an empire that challenged industrial mathematics with spiritual determination. The Americans used shells without thinking while we counted every round. In that difference lay not just tactical disadvantage, but strategic impossibility. Not just military defeat, but civilizational reckoning with the arithmetic of modern war. The shells have long since stopped falling. The guns have long since fallen silent. But in naval archives from Pearl Harbor to Yokosuka, in memoirs from Washington to Tokyo, the truth endures. The Pacific War was decided not by the courage of those who fired the shells, but by the capacity of those who made them. The Americans could afford to fire without thinking. The Japanese could only afford to think without firing. Between those two realities lay the abyss that swallowed an empire's ambitions and transformed the world's understanding of industrial warfare. The final testament comes not from admirals or historians, but from the numbers themselves, 47 billion to 15 million. In that ratio lies the Pacific War's true story, not of battles won or lost, but of an industrial colossus that could produce more ammunition than the world had ever seen, facing a nation that melted its temple bells to manufacture a few more shells. The Americans fired without thinking because they could afford to. The Japanese counted every round because they had to. And in that difference, the war's outcome was written before the first shot was fired.